it's CEO here, and we have proof that Brewster is being added into Animal Crossing New Horizons very soon. And in this video, I'm going to show you all the proof, so let's get into it. The big news we've heard lately about Brewster being added back into Animal Crossing New Horizons is from an information leak from Samus Hunter on Twitter. Samus says Animal Crossing New Horizons will have a major update that will likely introduce Brewster and his bar where you can meet old friends, and is set to be released in November at the latest. The Nintendo team has taken precautions to install the Halloween events without requiring a new update in case of delay after September. Now there's a lot to unpack here. First, the features of Brewster's Cafe that Samus talks about, where you can meet old friends at his bar, sounds extremely similar to how Brewster's Cafe functioned in the immediate predecessor to Animal Crossing New Horizons, Animal Crossing New Leaf. In New Leaf, you would see NPCs that you don't normally see sitting and having a cup of coffee in Brewster's Cafe. It's also interesting that Brewster will be added to New Horizons at November at the latest, according to Samus's tweet. This part excites me, but I'm also critical of it because there are so many events happening between now and November already. We have the Acorn and Pinecone season, the Mushroom season, Maple Leaf season, and of course, the Halloween event at the end of October. I would think Nintendo would add Brewster when there's a lull in the game without any big events. But on the other hand, Nintendo may want to add Brewster back into the game by this November to drum up excitement for Animal Crossing just in time for Black Friday and the ensuing Christmas holiday and the buying bonanza that accompanies it. Last holiday season, I saw a huge uptick in interest in Animal Crossing New Horizons, as many players received the game for the holidays. I could see Nintendo trying to mimic the same effect this year, especially after a huge disinterest in Animal Crossing lately, to increase sales, excitement, and interest for New Horizons again. The next point of proof I have for Brewster getting introduced into Animal Crossing New Horizons very soon is some suspicious data that can be viewed about the game by using a special program. If you have a modded Switch, and only if you have a modded Switch, you can use the specialized program to move any building to anywhere you want on the map, such as putting your house underwater, putting the airport on the land, and even moving your town plaza, which you typically can't do in the game. But this is not the proof I'm talking about that alluded to Brewster. What is more interesting is the menu in the program that lets you move the buildings. Let me show you. Each building is listed in the menu, and each building is assigned a number, going up in number numerically. Here you can see I have maxed out the menu, so I have all the buildings that are possible in the game set to be on the map. So if you would go onto this map, load it onto a Switch and go onto this map, you would see all these buildings, all 8 player houses. That's if you had 8 villagers, 8 human villagers on the island, all 10 of the animal villagers' houses, Nook's Cranny, the resident services building, the museum, airport, resident services tent, the campsite, all 8 bridges and all inclines, so basically maxing out your bridge and incline count. Also want to note quickly that bridges and inclines are considered buildings in the game's code. And then of course we have Red's Treasure Trawler, which is considered a building, and Harv's Studio, which is a building over on Harv's Island. Now what's interesting is that the studio is number 29, but when you go to number 30, there's no building, it just says 30. And the same for 31, and it goes all the way up to 100. Buildings 30 through 100 are nothing. Now what's interesting is here I've maxed out all the buildings. So I have every building that you could have on the island, even if it's not legal in the game. For example, I have the resident services tent and I have the resident services building built on this island that you can't do that normally. But I have that maxed out here anyway. Also, Nook's Cranny is considered one building, even though there are 2 variations of it, as well as the museum. The museum is also considered one building, even though it's a tent and then turns into a building. It's considered one building in this menu. And this menu basically visualizes the code for the buildings in the game. So therefore, after maxing out all the buildings that you could possibly have on the island that are in the game right now, there are still 3 empty spots for buildings. If you were doing this in the game, there would be 1 more free spot here, but I have the resident services tent and the resident services building existing at the same time. But let's just say, but for now, this example, there's 3 empty spaces. So this means, in theory, Nintendo has left 3 empty spaces for 3 new buildings. And since it's pretty likely Nintendo will add Brewster at some point, this is another thing pointing to it because it's a perfect opportunity. You have an empty building slot and Brewster could have his own building, so it'd be perfect. Nintendo already has the room for it. It just points to them doing it. It'd be one thing if all the buildings were maxed out and it was like nowhere in the game they could add it. I'm not a game developer, but I used to be a computer science major, and from what I know, it's easier to allocate room for future updates rather than try to add them on later after the program is finished. So these 3 buildings are probably definitely going to get filled by Nintendo at some point. Brewster is the main one in everyone's mind, but the 2 other free slots, aka 3 because of the resident services thing, but so 2 to 3 more free spots. I'm hoping that they introduce more buildings, honestly. We're missing Shampoodle, we're missing Leaf's building, Kix even had a building in the previous Animal Crossing game, Gracie Grace, the giraffe who would sell us overly expensive items and clothing. Even Club LOL was shrunk, and also KK Slider would play there at nights, and Katrina's building. There's a lot of buildings we are missing. So there are some free spots where those buildings could go. Looking at this, I see some potential Nintendo has been leaving for future updates, and if you ask me, this is definite proof we're getting Brewster. About a month after Animal Crossing New Horizons released, Twitter user Ninji, an ex-Animal Crossing data miner, discovered that in the Animal Crossing New Horizons code, we've already seen one museum upgrade which introduced the new art section, so this piece of information seems to be correct. Ninji also shared in the same tweet with us that in the code of Animal Crossing are 2 standalone buildings, the museum shop and the museum cafe, which includes a Gyroid section. Now, before I unpack all this information, you may be thinking, who is this Ninji and why should I trust their findings in the code of Animal Crossing? Ninji was correct about other predictions of Animal Crossing New Horizons by looking into the data code of the game. Ninji accurately predicted the additions of bushes being added back into New Horizons, as they weren't in the game when it released. Ninji also accurately shared that Animal Crossing would introduce vegetables that you can pick, including pumpkins, that were then added into the game later in 2020 in October, just in time for Halloween. So Ninji is a trusted source on future Animal Crossing updates. Now we have to unpack all the information about the museum upgrades and these 2 additional building slots. First, what Ninji said about the game having the data code for 2 standalone buildings matches exactly what I said earlier about the building moving program having 2 to 3 empty building slots. Those slots could easily be filled by the museum shop and museum cafe that Ninji talked about. Another interesting thing that Ninji pointed out about the museum cafe is that it has a Gyroid section. Now, for anyone who hasn't played the previous Animal Crossing games, Gyroids are furniture items that can be placed. They come in all different sizes and colors, with a general shape consistency throughout them all. You can turn them on by pressing A, and once you do that, they start moving around and making beep and boop noises. The pitch and note of the sound they make depends on their size and color. You would obtain gyroids by digging them up out of the ground, just like fossils. They appeared as a dig spot on the ground, but they would only appear in the ground after it rained. Now that you know a little bit about gyroids, let's take a look at Brewster's standalone building cafe from the immediate predecessor to Animal Crossing New Horizons, Animal Crossing New Leaf. Now, in Animal Crossing New Leaf, you had to unlock Brewster's cafe. It wasn't available immediately to players, but it still was in the game and required no updates from Nintendo for players to unlock it. Now in this cafe, we see Brewster and his little cafe setup. If you look behind the counter on his shelves, you can see 2 little gyroids perched, watching your every move. I bring this up because back to Ninji's tweet, it shared that in the code of New Horizons, the museum cafe will also include a gyroid section. This sounds pretty familiar to Brewster's cafe we see in New Horizons, so it's very likely that if and when we see this museum cafe with a gyroid section added to New Horizons, it will be for Brewster. It's also kind of weird that Nintendo took out gyroids. They were a huge staple part of the previous Animal Crossing games, even though they were kind of an annoyance as well. But they're one of the things that brings that charm to Animal Crossing, and it's seemingly missing from New Horizons. We do see Lloyd, who is also a gyroid in New Horizons, and we also have Coco, who's a rabbit villager inspired by gyroids, but we don't actually have the gyroid items themselves, and they're pretty iconic in the Animal Crossing series. Hopefully with Brewster's Cafe, we also see the introductions of minigames, like the Barista Minigame your villager could play in Animal Crossing New Leaf, where you can make coffee for different villagers living on your town. They would come in and you can make coffee, and each villager would have its own secret coffee order that they would like, and if you got it right, Brewster in the end would give you better coffee beans. I'm sure Nintendo will expand on that feature in New Horizons, but we don't know for sure. Very early into the career of Animal Crossing New Horizons, a photo was circulating around the internet of a villager talking about Brewster and mentioning his name in dialogue. Now, it's very strange for a villager to be talking about a character that seemingly doesn't exist in the game, which is very suspicious. From what I've seen while playing Animal Crossing New Horizons and previous Animal Crossing games, villagers only reference other characters that are clearly in the game that the human villager can interact with, like Tom Nook, Mabel, Flick, CJ, and Sahara, to name a few. So for Nintendo to have dialogue in the game talking about another NPC is a good indicator that Brewster will be coming to Animal Crossing as a dedicated character. Now, you may be wondering, why was this villager dialogue about Brewster in the game anyway? Well, it's very likely this dialogue appeared in the game early on as a mistake. Things were crazy back then when Animal Crossing released on March 20, 2020, so it's understandable there could have been a small slip-up, and this hidden Brewster dialogue was definitely added to the game too early by mistake. And since that photo circulated around the internet, there have been no other instances reported by players of villagers talking about Brewster. Nintendo has been known for adding and removing dialogue, especially lately we've been seeing new character dialogue from Isabelle and animal villagers, so Nintendo has the ability to add dialogue into the game, so of course they have the ability to remove dialogue as well. It goes both ways. So it's obvious that when Nintendo caught wind of this photo about villagers talking about Brewster on the internet and Twitter, they immediately pushed an update to the game to remove the dialogue. I'm really excited that more information has come out about the addition of Brewster in Animal Crossing New Horizons. I'm not alone in this sentiment, but New Horizons is lacking that charm that longtime players have felt in older Animal Crossing games. It's kind of a shame, but I still play New Horizons almost daily and still enjoy playing it. But with the addition of Brewster, a little bit of that old school Animal Crossing charm will be brought back to New Horizons, and I'm really excited for first-time Animal Crossing players to enjoy and experience it. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned a little more about Brewster's history along with it. Subscribe to my channel for more Animal Crossing content, and like this video if you want Brewster to be added back into New Horizons. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.